One of the most famous cases of all time, most tragic incidents in San Francisco history was the murder of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. Now, this case you investigated, but it was particularly close to you.
The Mayor Moscone Supervisor Milk murder case has affected my life in so many ways. I knew Dan White very, very well. He was the shortstop on my all-star team. He worked Northern Station with me when I was a patrolman. He was one of my better friends. I know he looked up to me. He told me a story where he was one of the younger boys at Portland Playground where we all worked out playing baseball. And he would shag balls for us all day long, and then we would let him hit at the end of the day. He said, "Don't you remember me, Frank?" Well, he brought back memories of, yes, I did remember Dan. And that was our first introduction to each other after many years being apart. Now he was a policeman, and like I say, he played on my all-star team. We won state championships. We were very close. He gave me a plaque after winning the second state championship. All the men had chipped in and honored me as the team manager. That day, when I received the phone call about shooting at City Hall, driving up there with my partner, Herman Clark, all I could think about was, this has to be related to Jonestown. 10 days prior, Jonestown had occurred where Jim Jones had over 400 people drink the Kool-Aid. And I was convinced that this was going to tie in to Jim Jones. And when we entered, Herman and I, we ran up the staircase to the mayor's office. I was met at the top of the stairs by Sergeant Jim Molinari, the mayor's bodyguard. And he looked at me, he says, "Frank, the mayor's dead." I said, "Jesus, the mayor's dead. Do we have a suspect?" He said, "Yeah, Dan White." It was tough enough being told I had a murder at City Hall. Hearing Dan White, somebody I trusted, somebody I cared for, somebody I thought as a kid brother, was the suspect. It was crazy, absolutely insane. Last person I would have ever expected was Dan White. Dan White had gone to the parochial schools. He never heard Dan White swear. He was one of the nicest guys. He would open the door for a lady, always very polite. Tough kid. He was very tough. Star football player, great baseball player, boxing champion out at the Olympic Club. He wasn't a pushover, but he definitely wasn't a murderer. And now I was investigating him as a murderer. And I remember going in, seeing the mayor laying on the floor, cigarettes still burning in his fingers. I walked out of his anti-room over to his main desk, and I went to use the phone. I was going to put out an all-points bulletin to have the police pick up Dan White for investigation of murder. It was at that point in time that Chief of Inspectors, Jeremiah Taylor, said, "Frank, Dan White has just turned himself into Northern Station." So Tom Norman, the prosecutor, and another prosecutor named John Rowland joined me. Herman stayed at the crime scene. Tom, John, and I ran out, jumped in the car, went to Northern Station. I was told 2 other homicide detectives had picked up Dan, and he was waiting for me in the homicide detail. When I got there, I had been told by Paul Chignell he wasn't going to give a statement, that he had taken his Miranda rights and refused to talk. But when I opened the door to the interrogation room and I saw Dan, He stood up and he looked at me. I looked at him. I was angry. What the hell could you have been thinking? What were you thinking? He got all choked up, started convulsing. The best way I can describe it is it was like a lid came off a pressure cooker. All his emotions came boiling out. I want to tell you, Frank, I want to tell you the truth. Stop. If we're going to do this, Dan, we're going to do it right. He knew I was that kind of cop. I went out to my desk. I got my tape recorder. I got a clean cassette. I looked around the office. The only one was Eddie Erdlatz. I said, Ed, can you please sit in with me? It's always best to have two inspectors sitting in with a suspect. Ed went in with me, and we took now the famous admission or infamous admission to 2 murders.
It was just like a roaring in my ears, and then it just came to me, and then that was it. Then I just shot him.
If you hadn't have been standing there when that door opened, do you think you would have gotten that confession out of Dan White? Do you think the SFPD would have gotten the confession?
There's no doubt in my mind that when Dan White saw me, and I know for a fact he had a deep respect for me, because when he was going to run for city supervisor, he came down. He says, Frank, you're the first one I'm going to tell. I'm going to run for city supervisor. I said, Jesus, why do you want to go up there? You're crazy to go up to City Hall. You're a great fireman. You're a great policeman. Very successful paratrooper. Why? He says, I want to help the people of our neighborhood. We had both grown up in District 11 out off Silver San Bruno Avenue, the Visitation Valley. I just shook my head, and I'll never forget, Jack Cleary told him point blank, you're crazy. Don't go up to City Hall. You'll be in over your head. And Jack hit the nail right on the head. Dan never belonged at City Hall. He was too rigid. I didn't realize it then, but obviously he was too rigid for the give and take that occurs every day at City Hall.
Now, you got that confession. In your mind, was this a slam dunk? In your mind, was this a slam dunk murder one case?
Oh, there was no doubt in my mind when I walked out of that room with the information we had and a confession to 2 murders. I felt there was 2 first-degree murder cases, yes.
Were you conflicted at all that this was your friend that had just admitted to it versus your responsibility as a police inspector to secure the evidence and ideally get a conviction in a case like that?
I was friend second, inspector first. I had a job to do, and I was going to do that job to the best of my ability. And even to the fact that when he was released from prison, I went down to Los Angeles, and I spent time with Dan when he was hiding from the media and the public, and he was on parole. I spent 3 days with him to find out if I missed anything, and I was very shocked to find out what I was told.
What did he tell you?
We were sitting outside the Coliseum. It was a track and field event and some boxing matches that we had attended.
For the Olympics?
At the '84 Olympics. This is after Dan was paroled.
So you were trying to pick his brain to learn more about the case and in general become a better homicide inspector?
He had called me, and he wanted to know if I would come down and see him. I said, absolutely. I said, I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of things unanswered in my mind that I need to know. And when I met him, everything was pretty much straight up the first day. Second day, I think we saw some boxing matches. Third day, track and field. And then that afternoon, when we were sitting out in the courtyard, we each ordered a bag of chips, a hot dog, and a Diet Coke. And while we were eating lunch, I looked at him. I said, you know, Dan, I have to ask you, what did I miss? I thought I was pretty thorough. What did I miss? He looked at me. He said, boy, I really lost it that day, didn't I? I said, oh, God, yeah, you lost it. You lost it big time. He says, I wanted to get 4 people. He said, remember I had extra bullets in my pocket? I said, yeah. He says, I had taken 21 rounds. I had a 5-shot revolver. 4 people were going to get 5 shots. The last one, the 21st bullet, was to kill myself. I fell back in the seat. I was stunned. I said, you had 2 other victims? He said, yeah. I said, who were they? He says, I was going to get Willie Brown. I said, Willie Brown, this ex-supervisor? He says, yeah. He was the puppeteer pulling Moscone's strings. And he said the other one was Carol Ruth Silver. I said, Carol Ruth Silver? I didn't know much about her. He says, yeah, she was the biggest snake of all. He never elaborated, and I never asked any more questions because I was dumbfounded. That day could have been twice as bad with 4 people killed. Willie Brown had just walked out of Moscone's office 5 minutes before Dan walked in the main door. That's how close Willie came. Crazy.
Famously, Dan White was only convicted of manslaughter, the famous Twinkie defense as it was come to know.
Yeah,
What do you make of the prosecution and the mistakes that were made there that allowed him to be released and ultimately, tell his story to you down in Southern California?
First of all, I have to stand up for Tom Norman as a prosecutor. Personally, there was nobody better. But this was not a run-of-the-mill case. Tom Norman knew he had 2 first-degree murder convictions, just knew it. And he tried it, put in all the evidence methodically. To Doug Schmid's credit, Doug Schmid was a defense attorney. Every point, Doug Schmid had a counterpoint. Now, you could argue, were his counterpoints valid? The other thing that hurt Tom Norman was people who would have convicted Dan White of murder in the first degree were being excluded from the jury by themselves. Most gays, most blacks are not for the death penalty, so they were excusing themselves.
So he was trying the case as a capital murder case with the intention of getting the death penalty.
Yes.
So you're saying that a lot of the potential jurors who would have likely been someone who would have convicted Dan White were excluded from the panel.
That is a fact.
So what happened is he ultimately had a more conservative jury that maybe felt more sympathetic to a more conservative defendant.
I have never seen, from a policeman's point of view, a jury I would like on every one of my cases. I looked back at the panel when Dan White was being tried, and I thought, oh my God, it looks like the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, Country Club. Those were all the people in the courtroom. It truly was rare in San Francisco to see so many conservative faces. That was the panel. And then those that were not conservative eliminated themselves because they wouldn't sustain a death penalty case. So Tom Norman did his normal, typical, awesome job. To Doug Schmid's credit, he countered every point. What I saw was a jury much middle American, and they were looking at Dan White as if he was their child, their son, or brother, boyfriend. He was the all-American boy, and Doug Schmid played that up. What happened to Dan White? This Catholic school boy with the 10 Commandments and following his faith throughout his life doesn't kill two people in cold blood. And the jury was buying it. When Mayor Dianne Feinstein testified, jurors cried. When I was on the witness stand, I played the tape confession. Jurors were crying. Dan White's tape was very emotional, but it was self-serving. He was explaining why he felt justified. Well, he may have been justified going down there and punching both George and Harvey in the nose, but he was not justified taking out a gun and killing two people in cold blood. And Dan White knew that. He wasn't dumb. He was very smart.
He eventually killed himself, likely based on some of the guilt associated with this homicide, I would imagine.
Yeah, I was on call that day also, and I got a call to go out to an address in the Excelsior district, and when I turned the corner, I knew right away it was Dan White's home. And I had suspected it. There was a Chronicle reporter by the name of Susan Sward. We had done lunch together, and she asked me point blank, Falzon, do you think it's right that your friend is free and the mayor's dead and the supervisor's dead? And I looked at her and I said, Susan, I don't think it's right. And neither does Dan White. I said, you don't know what's going on between his two ears. I said, he's living a living hell right now. I said, the final chapter hasn't been written. Little did I know, I was predicting Dan White's eventual suicide. And that day when I saw his body, it was lying in the garage. He had taped a hose to his car. He had pictures of his wife and children. He had said he made an act of contrition, which is in the Catholic faith, asking God for forgiveness. And he was taking his own life. When I arrived on the scene, he was lying face up on the cold pavement next to the driver's door. I could see the duct tape and the hose and the windows all taped so that he asphyxiated himself with carbon monoxide. Kneeling over him was a Catholic priest from the Church of Epiphany, giving him the last rites, and two Catholic school nuns in full regalia, starched collars, rosary beads, were praying over his body. I just looked at him and I couldn't believe, thinking back to all those fun days on the ball field we had and the simpler times just doing police work when he was a good fireman. All this was crazy. I went upstairs and his brother Tommy was hysterical. Tommy was just bawling like a baby, punching the wall with his fist, wanting to know how stupid could Dan be? Why did he do this to me? Why did I have to find his body? And I looked at him, I said, you know, Tommy, I put him in my arms. I said, I think Dan is passing the torch to you. He had led the family and he was ashamed of what he did. It's now your turn to pick up where Dan left off. You're now the leader of the family. Yeah, very tragic case.
Did you ever think that the confession that you got out of Dan White would be turned around and used by his defense? And what's just your thoughts on how that played out?
The reason as a homicide detective we take tape statements is because they speak for themselves. The jury gets to hear your words, my words. We're all on tape. In other words, you can't say I put words in your mouth or vice versa. The tape was very, very emotional. Did I ever think the jury would see some outlet to let Dan off easy? No.
And were you criticized at all for the way you took that confession?
I did get criticized, and it wasn't from my peers or from the district attorney's office. It was from friends of Harvey and friends of George who felt I should have given a more hardline question and answer. And my answer to that is I had zero clue as to what happened up at City Hall. So that morning I was really working off of Dan's words. And I had a man that just killed 2 people, and he's spilling everything out. I'm listening and I'm picking up as we're going along, questioning what he's telling me. At some point, I learned that Harvey Milk had also been shot. I hadn't known that when I got to the Hall of Justice.
Looking back on all these cases, what goes through your head knowing that you were so close to these momentous pieces of history, not only in San Francisco, but just our country in general? You were right there as it unfolded.
You know, looking back, Evan, I see our country right now split down the middle. Today, conservative, liberal. That's pretty much what happened back with the Dan White case. The Board of Supervisors had been 6-5 conservative, and that's what the issue was. That's what Mayor Moscone was asked not to put Dan back on because he was a conservative vote. We want a more liberal vote. That's what it was all about. You'd think we could learn from history that people have to learn to work together, but it just seems like the extreme people on one end and the extreme people on the other end are the ones making the most noise and getting the most attention. When people that could come together for the common cause, for the common community. Look at San Francisco. I mean, nobody won on that Dan White case. Nobody won. You might say Mayor Dianne Feinstein, but I think she would give up everything she accomplished in a heartbeat. She loved Dan White. She was very close to Dan. Just a sad time in history, and I pray to God we don't see it repeating as a country.